The day the moving truck pulled into Cedar Ridge Estates, the sun gleamed over endless lines of pristine homes, each identical in color, posture, and design, a suburban clone army of perfection. The lawns were shaved to regulation height, driveways spotless, mailboxes aligned like soldiers awaiting inspection. To most, it was paradise. To Agent Daniel Harlow, it was peace, or so he thought. After 15 years in federal service, dealing with the dirtiest corners of humanity, corruption, organized crime, and government deceit, Daniel wanted quiet. A place where his wife Lee and their young daughter Ava could finally breathe. The Harlow home sat on the corner lot, slightly elevated above the cul-de-sac, with a wraparound porch and the scent of cedar still fresh from construction. It was his dream come true, a reward for years of serving in shadows. He admired how the morning light poured through the glass panes, how Lee's laughter echoed through the empty halls as they unpacked, and how Ava chased butterflies in the backyard that sloped gently toward a narrow creek. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe the world was good, but paradise has a price. The HOA president, Karen Whitmore, introduced herself that evening with a practiced smile and a clipboard in hand. Her pearl necklace caught the light like a weapon. Behind her, two other board members hovered: Richard, the vice president whose posture screamed superiority, and Mabel, the treasurer who rarely spoke but observed everything. Their welcome felt polite, but beneath the courtesy was control. They praised his home, admired the layout, yet subtly inserted reminders. No visible trash cans, no fences above 4 feet, no alterations without approval. Daniel brushed it off. Rules were rules. After all, order was something he respected. For the next few weeks, things seemed normal. He spent evenings fixing the garden, Lee painted the porch swing blue, her favorite color, and Ava decorated the mailbox with hand-painted stars. It was home. But perfection in Cedar Ridge came with eyes everywhere. It started with small notes. One, tucked under the door, complained that his grass was 2 inches higher than regulation. Another warned that his porch swing color wasn't on the approved palette. Then came a fine, $50 for leaving a garden hose visible overnight. At first, Daniel laughed. Bureaucracy was nothing new, but Lee's laughter faded with each notice. Soon, their mailbox filled with threats disguised as reminders. Failure to comply may result in property lien or legal action. Then came the unthinkable. Daniel returned home one afternoon to find a group of HOA contractors tearing apart his front yard, ripping up the flowers Lee had planted, removing the new mailbox, even prying apart the porch swing. Their explanation: non-compliant modifications. Lee stood on the steps, tears streaking her cheeks, clutching a letter marked "Final Notice." It declared that their unapproved home alterations violated HOA aesthetics and structural standards, giving the board authority to enforce restoration to original community design. He tried to reason, but the men only followed orders. Behind them, Karen watched from her car, sunglasses hiding her expression but her satisfaction unmistakable. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The house felt smaller, colder. Lee's silence cut deeper than any reprimand. He walked through the empty yard, now stripped bare, and saw the faint outline where Ava's swing once hung, now gone like their peace. He thought about all he'd given to protect others, the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the missions that never made the news. And now, here in the comfort of suburban America, he was powerless against a woman with a clipboard and a vendetta. But power, Daniel knew, wasn't always visible. When the HOA ordered a lien against his property for unpaid fines he never owed, something inside him shifted. It wasn't anger, it was purpose. That same quiet, methodical focus he once used in the field began to stir again. He opened his old safe that night, the one sealed since his retirement, and stared at the federal insignia embossed on his ID. Special Agent Daniel Harlow, Federal Bureau of Investigation. He traced his thumb over the badge's cold metal surface. The HOA thought they were untouchable, that no one could challenge their petty empire of control. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. In the quiet darkness of his stripped-down dream home, Daniel made himself a silent promise. They wanted to play by rules, he'd remind them who wrote the rulebook. And as the sprinklers clicked on across Cedar Ridge, watering identical lawns under identical skis, Daniel Harlow began planning the most calculated act of suburban revenge the neighborhood would ever witness. The hunter was back. And this time his prey wore pearls. Cedar Ridge slept under a false sense of order. The white fences gleamed, lawns were neatly trimmed, and porch lights glowed in synchronized harmony. But behind those pristine facades, secrets thrived, and Daniel Harlow knew where secrets hid best: in paperwork, whispers, and power. He had seen the type before: bureaucrats in blazers pretending to be leaders, manipulating fear under the guise of community values. The HOA wasn't about aesthetics, it was about control. Every signature, every violation notice, every anonymous complaint was another thread in a web spun by Karen Whitmore and her board. Daniel didn't start with confrontation, he started with observation. Each morning he'd leave for work early, or so it seemed. Instead, he sat in his car at the edge of the cul-de-sac, hidden beneath the shade of the oak trees, watching. He tracked who entered the HOA office, who Karen met at the clubhouse, who lingered too long near his property. His federal training returned like muscle memory, quiet, precise, and unstoppable. He began collecting evidence the way only a seasoned agent could. When he received another fine, this one for improperly tinted windows, he noticed something odd. The violation form wasn't digitally signed by the board but hand-signed by Richard, the vice president. Daniel scanned the document, cross-referenced it with the county property codes, and found that half the cited regulations didn't even exist. It was fabricated. He smiled. One thread pulled loose. At night when Lee and Ava were asleep, he would sit in his office with the blinds drawn, the glow of his laptop illuminating stacks of printed HOA documents. He accessed county databases, searched property liens, and traced money flows between the HOA and contractors. What he found painted a story far darker than petty control. The HOA had been overcharging homeowners for community maintenance, amounts that never matched the county's public records. Thousands of dollars were being funneled into shell companies. And each of those companies was connected back to one person, Karen's brother-in-law. Fraud, racketeering, misuse of homeowner funds, a suburban cartel masquerading as a community organization. Daniel gathered it all, screenshot by screenshot, document by document, but he wasn't ready to act, not yet. Timing mattered. Exposure too early could lead to denial, destroyed evidence, or legal cover-ups. He needed something irrefutable, something that would make the HOA implode under its own arrogance. So he kept watching. He installed a motion-activated camera near his driveway light, hidden behind a decorative birdhouse, another inside the mailbox capturing anyone tampering with their mail. He even embedded a tiny recording device near the community clubhouse during one of the open meetings. What he captured there changed everything. Through the faint hum of the recording, he heard Karen's voice, smug, commanding, dripping with entitlement. She was instructing board members on how to keep the neighborhood compliant, even suggesting they target troublemakers to set examples. She mentioned his name directly. Harlow thinks he's above the rules. We'll make sure he learns who runs Cedar Ridge. The room erupted with laughter. Daniel listened to that clip over and over, not in anger but in analysis. Each word, each tone was a confession wrapped in arrogance. And arrogance, he knew, was the first crack in any empire. The next week he attended the HOA's public meeting. He sat silently in the back, face calm, demeanor ordinary. Karen stood at the front, dressed in her usual power suit, addressing residents about preserving neighborhood values. Her eyes brushed past him once, just for a second, and Daniel caught that flicker, that tiny spark of satisfaction. She thought she'd broken him. But in reality, she'd built his case. By the time the meeting ended, Daniel had already copied the HOA's meeting agenda, recorded the board's motions, and discreetly photographed documents left carelessly on the table. Among them was a payment request, over $30,000 approved for landscaping renovations. The contractor name was a familiar one, Whitmore Property Services, her husband's business. Now the pieces aligned. The HOA wasn't just abusing power, it was laundering money through fake community projects, using inflated fines to fund private pockets. But even the best investigation needed patience. So Daniel played his role perfectly. He mowed his lawn to regulation height. He smiled politely at neighbors. He even paid one of the smaller fines publicly, ensuring Karen believed she'd won. Every small act of compliance became camouflage for the storm he was brewing. By midsummer, he had compiled a dossier thick enough to bury the entire board: bank records, falsified documents, hidden audio files, and legal references that would make even the most confident attorney sweat. But Daniel wasn't done. Evidence wasn't enough. Exposure needed impact. He contacted an old colleague from the bureau, someone still on the inside. Under the radar, he requested verification on several accounts and company names. Within days, his suspicions were confirmed. The HOA's financial transactions violated federal fraud statutes. He leaned back in his chair that night, watching the streetlights reflect off his window. The hum of crickets filled the silence, the world outside perfectly ordinary, while beneath it the foundation of Cedar Ridge was beginning to crack. But revenge wasn't just about justice. It was about making the guilty feel the weight of every action, publicly, painfully, and irreversibly. So Daniel decided he wouldn't simply report them. He'd dismantle them, piece by piece. He began feeding anonymous tips to local homeowners, details about their inflated dues, their missing maintenance funds, and inconsistencies in the HOA's policies. He sent one resident the scanned page of the HOA ledger showing duplicate transactions. Another received proof that the fines issued to her were completely invalid under state law. Within days, the community began to murmur. Small conversations turned into angry discussions. Homeowners began questioning the board during meetings. The once feared HOA now faced resistance, confusion spreading like wildfire. And at the center of it all, Daniel remained silent, a ghost orchestrating their downfall from the shadows. Karen, of course, didn't suspect him, not yet. Her arrogance blinded her. She believed the chaos was coincidence, the product of ungrateful residents. But Daniel knew better, because he was the storm. And as his evidence file reached its final stage, he planned the strike that would end Cedar Ridge's reign once and for all. In 1 week there would be a board audit, something the HOA had scheduled months ago to maintain appearances of legality. Karen saw it as a formality. Daniel saw it as Judgment Day. The night before the audit, he placed the final envelope in his safe, labeled simply, Cedar Ridge Federal Evidence. He looked at it for a long moment before locking it shut. The silence of the night whispered with coming ruin. The HOA had destroyed his dream home. Now he was about to destroy their kingdom. The audit was public only by name, a tidy line on the HOA calendar meant to reassure residents that someone somewhere kept an eye on the finances. Karen treated it like theater, scripted, rehearsed, controlled. She arranged the venue, invited the familiar faces, and polished the ledger entries until they gleamed under fluorescent lights. To her, it was a coronation disguised as due diligence. To Daniel, it was an open door. He spent the days before the audit moving like a shadow through the neighborhood, a presence nobody registered. He left anonymous packets on kitchen counters, slipped copies of suspicious invoices into mailboxes late at night, and made sure the board's most incriminating documents were exposed not as evidence to law enforcement, yet but to the people the HOA could no longer ignore, the homeowners. On the morning of the audit, Cedar Ridge woke with an electric charge. Word had leaked carefully, selectively, like a low rumble in the distance that soon rose into a chorus of murmurs and pointed glances. Neighbors arrived early, clutching their printed copies of ledgers and suspicious receipts, faces tight with questions. The clubhouse filled with the rustle of paper and the soft, tense energy of a community about to wake up. Karen entered with her usual poise, but this time the room watched her with something sharper than respect. The board filed in behind her, Richard with practiced calm, Mabel with a tightness in her jaw. They sat as if the room belonged to them, yet the air had shifted. It had the smell of confrontation, inevitable, drawn out, and public. Daniel took a seat near the back, folding his hands in his lap, his face ordinary, almost invisible. He watched as the meeting began and let the scene unfold like a play he had seen 1,000 times from a different vantage point. This time, every line scripted against them. The audit opened with small, procedural items, minutes to be approved, routine motions passed to show compliance. It felt comfortable, like a warm-up before the real performance. Karen guided the meeting with smooth words, but when the board presented the financial summary, the cracks that had been carefully masked with forged entries and duplicate invoices began to show under the weight of scrutiny. Someone near the front raised a hand, a woman who had been one of the first recipients of Daniel's anonymous packet. She asked a pointed question about a landscaper's payment that seemed excessive for the scope of work. The board offered a practiced answer, but the woman produced the invoice Daniel had sent her, matching it with earlier records she had pulled from the county website. The numbers didn't align. One by one, the packets Daniel had distributed were revealed: duplicate billing, payments to Whitmore Property Services for projects that had never occurred, fines levied for arbitrary reasons with no legal basis. Homeowners held hard copies in their hands and for the first time felt the power shift away from the board. A hush fell over the room, not of submission but of calculation. Faces turned to Karen. Her smile faltered. Her composure, usually unassailable, looked brittle under the weight of facts. She tried to reframe, to redirect the conversation to process, to bylaw minutiae, but each attempt was met by another homeowner with another packet, another discrepancy. Daniel observed the collapse like a strategist watching a fortress's foundation crumble. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Everything he had planted was blooming now, not in vindictive blossoms but in raw, visible proof. The board tried to regain control with procedural motions, but the residents demanded accountability. Voices rose, not in chaos but in a chorus of combined authority. Each homeowner that stood did so with documents in hand, with dates and invoices and ledger entries that could not be shrugged off as misunderstanding. Karen's smirk shrank under the community's resolve. At a critical moment, when the board attempted to dismiss a mounting complaint as clerical error, the clubhouse doors opened and a man in plain clothes entered, not an officer in uniform but someone whose presence carried the weight of an institution. It was an auditor from the county, summoned anonymously by the cascade of citizen complaints. He walked in with the quiet certainty of someone who knew what to look for. The county auditor did not speak of arrests or indictments. He spoke of accounting irregularities, of compliance violations, and of the need for formal investigation. His tone was technical, clinical, but the implication was unmistakable. This was no longer a neighborhood squabble. This was an external probe. Gasps rippled through the room like a wind through dry leaves. Karen's eyes darted around, searching for an ally. Richard's fingers tightened around his pen. Mabel sat motionless, face unreadable. The board's veneer of control had been punctured by the combined force of evidence, community action, and the looming presence of oversight beyond their sphere. Outside, the neighborhood watched through curtains and from behind blinds. For weeks they had seen the Whitmore name on notices and in petty rulings. For the first time, they recognized the enormity of the deception. The HOA had been a machine quietly siphoning funds for private gain, weaponizing rules to silence dissent, and fostering fear to maintain its grip. Now that machine was exposed to light. Daniel felt no satisfaction in watching them unravel. Revenge, for him, was not mere vindictiveness, it was correction. He remembered Lee's hollowed expression after the contractors had torn up their yard, the way Ava had searched for her swing and touched the empty space where it had hung. He thought of the small indignities his family had been forced to endure. This moment was a restitution of dignity to a community that had been exploited. As the meeting adjourned for a temporary recess, the room buzzed with a new kind of energy, a combination of relief and fear. Homeowners clustered into groups, trading notes and strategizing. Some called for immediate legal counsel, others wanted the board removed that afternoon. The county auditor requested copies of all meeting minutes and financial records, and announced that a formal investigation would commence. Karen retreated to a corner with her closest allies, speaking in tones too low for the room but loud enough for the sharpest ears to catch tremors of panic. Daniel watched her from across the room, measuring the angles of her retreat. Her expression was not one of an innocent leader besieged but of a cornered operative calculating the best escape route. He had set the trap not to watch them squirm but to compel them into the light, to force a community to reclaim agency. The board's authority had lived in the shadows. Once exposed, it withered under scrutiny. That was the point of the trap, not a public spectacle of ruin but a public restoration of truth. As homeowners filed out, some angry, some relieved, the clubhouse emptied into a neighborhood forever changed. Conversations that had once centered on lawn aesthetics now revolved around restitution, legal rights, and the implications of a rogue governing body. People who had once felt powerless now spoke with conviction. They were no longer mere subjects to bylaws and fines. They were stakeholders with documents and witnesses and the audacity to demand justice. Daniel stayed behind until the last resident left. He walked slowly through the empty clubhouse, the flip charts and banners that once proclaimed community values now looking like props in a theater whose script had been subverted. He paused by the whiteboard where Karen had outlined community initiatives. The ink on the paper now read like a confession when matched against the letters poured onto the table earlier. Outside, the summer sky had deepened into late afternoon, the heat softened into a cool edge that hinted at the evening to come. The neighborhood, to all outward appearances, returned to its routine. Children played in yards, sprinklers went on as scheduled, and mailboxes still lined the street. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, a seismic shift had occurred. Control had been challenged. Trust had been fractured. The HOA's position was no longer one of unquestioned authority. Daniel walked home with a slow, purposeful pace. He passed Lee on the porch, who watched him with eyes that reflected wary hope. Ava waved from the yard with a small, tentative smile that made the knot in his chest loosen. He entered the house and placed his dossier on the kitchen table. Then sat and let the silence settle around him like a cloak that for once felt deserved. He had set the trap and baited it with the precise pieces of truth that could not be denied. The fall would follow: legal processes, perhaps arrests, maybe appeals and posturing, but the first domino had fallen. The board's empire of petty tyranny had been destabilized, and Cedar Ridge would never be the same. The night crept in as the streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the trimmed lawns. Daniel listened to the hush, hearing not just the ordinary sounds of suburbia but the echo of something larger, the return of power to its rightful owners. He knew the coming days would test them all. Karen would not go quietly. There would be countermoves, denials, and desperate attempts to salvage reputation and control. The board's allies would circle and the legal machinery would begin its slow, grinding dance. But the trap had been set, and the first steps of reparation had been taken. The hunt, Daniel acknowledged, was not yet over. It had only moved from the careful gathering of evidence to the theater of consequence. The next chapter would be about exposure writ large, about the mechanisms of power being turned against themselves. He turned out the lights and stood at his doorway a moment longer, watching the cul-de-sac with the practiced patience of a man who had stared down danger in far darker places. The neighborhood slept, but nothing about it was the same. Somewhere between the trimmed hedges and the lamplight, justice had begun to move. The morning after the audit felt different in Cedar Ridge. The air was heavy, not with the calm of suburbia but with the silence that follows revelation. The streets, once echoing with lawnmowers and idle chatter, now carried whispers. Every house that had once seemed identical was now divided by suspicion. Neighbors glanced at one another, no longer bound by the illusion of community but by the shared realization that they had been deceived. For years, the HOA board had ruled with quiet tyranny, masking greed with regulation. But now the mask had cracked, and behind it was rot, exposed, undeniable, and spreading. Daniel Harlow watched it unfold from his porch, his coffee untouched. The morning light glinted off the empty space where Ava's blue porch swing once hung, a wound he refused to repair until justice was complete. He could hear murmurs from down the street, homeowners gathering in clusters, waving printed papers, voices hushed but urgent. His plan had worked. The board was no longer feared, they were cornered. By midday, the news had escaped the boundaries of the neighborhood. An anonymous packet, sent by Daniel under a generic email address, had landed on the desk of a local journalist known for exposing corruption. Within hours, a reporter and a camera crew arrived at the front gates of Cedar Ridge Estates. Their van idled by the curb as residents cautiously emerged, drawn to the spectacle like moths to a flame. Karen Whitmore, the HOA president, appeared from her house in a pressed suit and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She greeted the reporters with forced politeness, her voice steady but strained. She spoke of disgruntled residents and misunderstandings, her tone designed to reassure. But the more she spoke, the more her words rang hollow. The reporters' questions were precise, too precise. Daniel had made sure of that. The journalist had been fed not just rumors but evidence, bank statements, falsified maintenance contracts, and even snippets of Karen's recorded words from the clubhouse. Her interview quickly turned from a defense into a cross-examination. Behind the camera, residents gathered. They weren't angry, not yet, but their silence was a warning. Every time Karen smiled, every time she tried to shift blame, that silence grew heavier, sharper. It was the sound of patience thinning into rage. By evening, the local news channel aired the story under the headline, HOA under fire, allegations of fraud and corruption in Cedar Ridge estates. The footage was damning, a montage of Karen's evasive interview, the county auditor's statements, and close-up shots of documents that Daniel had leaked. Viewers saw the Whitmore name stamped across contractor payments, the inflated fines, and the trails of money flowing into personal accounts. Within hours, social media caught fire. Comments flooded local forums. Knew something was off about that HOA. They fined me $200 for planting roses. Where's our money, Karen? The once pristine image of Cedar Ridge began to crumble in public view. Karen tried to fight back. She released statements through the HOA's website denying wrongdoing, accusing certain individuals of fabricating evidence. But her posts were met with screenshots, undeniable proof of her misdeeds, collected and circulated by residents who had finally found their voices. Meanwhile, Daniel worked quietly behind the scenes. He wasn't interested in fame or credit. He was interested in precision, ensuring that every piece of the puzzle fit together in a way that would hold under legal scrutiny. He'd seen corruption collapse before in government offices, in corporate backrooms, but never had he watched it crumble in such an intimate setting. Cedar Ridge had become his case file. The manicured lawns and perfect homes were evidence exhibits, each one tied to a system of control now unraveling thread by thread. Within a week, the fallout deepened. The county's Department of Consumer Affairs announced a full investigation into the HOA. Subpoenas were issued. Bank accounts were frozen. The HOA's official operations were suspended pending review. A temporary committee made up of volunteer homeowners was installed to manage community affairs until further notice. The board members scattered like startled birds. Richard resigned quietly, leaving a short letter on his porch. Mabel vanished from public sight entirely. But Karen, proud, unyielding Karen, refused to step down. She framed herself as the victim of a witch hunt, declaring her intent to fight for justice and protect the HOA's integrity. It was the arrogance Daniel had counted on. He knew she'd try to fight, and that made her predictable. Every statement she made, every desperate attempt to control the narrative, only tightened the net. When she filed a defamation claim against the journalist, she inadvertently triggered legal discovery, granting investigators access to the HOA's full communications. Within those emails, Daniel's final pieces of evidence waited to be found. Years of internal correspondence detailing fines, fabricated violations, and instructions to make examples of non-compliant residents. The trap had closed. The night the warrants were served, Cedar Ridge didn't sleep. Police cruisers arrived silently, red and blue lights reflecting off the uniform houses like judgment. Neighbors watched from windows as Karen was escorted from her home, still protesting her innocence. Her pearl necklace gleamed beneath the flashing lights, a symbol of power now turned into a reminder of downfall. As the cars drove away, the street returned to stillness. The hum of engines faded, replaced by the slow exhale of relief. Doors opened, people stepped outside. For the first time, the residents of Cedar Ridge stood together, not as subjects of rules but as a community reclaimed. Daniel stood at the edge of his porch, arms crossed, the night wind brushing past him. Lee joined him quietly, her hand resting on his shoulder. For a long moment, neither spoke. They simply watched the lights fade into the distance, the weight of months of tension dissolving into quiet triumph. It wasn't celebration. It was justice, slow, deliberate, earned. Over the following days, the investigation expanded. County officials uncovered embezzled funds exceeding $200,000. The HOA's legal representation resigned. Multiple lawsuits emerged from residents who had been fined or harassed under false pretenses. The local news continued to follow the story, branding it the Cedar Ridge scandal. It became a cautionary tale, a story of power corrupted by greed and undone by truth. Reporters revisited the neighborhood months later, capturing images of new committees, open meetings, and residents voting on reforms to ensure transparency. But behind every headline and every resolution, there was a man who never spoke on record, the quiet architect of the downfall. Daniel never revealed his identity to the media. To his neighbors, he was simply the man who had moved in with his family and endured what they all had, only to stand taller in the end. But at night, when he opened his safe and looked at the badge he once carried, he knew this case had been more than revenge. It was closure for his family, for the community, for the part of himself that could never stand idle in the face of injustice. Still, not everything was at peace. Cedar Ridge was healing, yes, but scars remained. The community had lost its innocence. Trust would take time. And deep down, Daniel knew the game wasn't fully over. People like Karen didn't vanish quietly. They resurfaced, rebuilt, retaliated. And in the coming weeks, subtle signs began to appear: anonymous letters in mailboxes, vandalized property, whispers of revenge among Karen's lingering loyalists. Justice had exposed the rot, but now the rot was stirring again, angry, desperate, unseen. Daniel felt it before anyone else. The calm before another storm. He had thought his work was done, but he was wrong, because power never dies quietly. The calm that followed Karen Whitmore's arrest was fragile, like thin glass resting on the edge of a table, beautiful but one touch away from shattering. For a few brief weeks, Cedar Ridge looked almost normal again. Lawns were trimmed, porch lights glowed, and children laughed in the cul-de-sac. But beneath the surface, tension coiled tight. Because corruption doesn't die overnight, it hides, it waits. Daniel Harlow knew this too well. He had seen men in power fall from grace only to crawl back from the shadows armed with vengeance and desperation. And he could feel it now, that quiet vibration in the air, that unease that seeped through the neighborhood like smoke through cracks. The HOA's empire had been toppled, but the loyalists, those who'd benefited from its reign, were still out there watching. It began with the smallest things. A single nail carefully placed beneath one of his truck's tires, the morning sprinklers suddenly cutting off though he'd never missed a water bill, a scratch across the side of Lee's car deep enough to be deliberate. These weren't random acts of vandalism, they were messages, subtle reminders that the war wasn't over. Lee wanted to call the police. Daniel told her to wait. This isn't overreaction, he thought, it's reconnaissance. Whoever was behind it wasn't reckless, they were testing boundaries, probing for weakness. The very same tactics he'd used in the field, only now turned against him. And then the letters began, folded sheets of paper slipped into mailboxes across Cedar Ridge. No signature, just typed lines dripping with venom. The HOA kept this place perfect. Now look what you've done. You think you won, but this neighborhood belongs to order. Some rules can't be broken. The residents grew uneasy. Old fear returned in whispers. Some believed Karen's followers were trying to regroup, others thought she'd orchestrated it from behind bars. But Daniel knew the psychology, the language of control, the rhythm of intimidation. It was organized, calculated, deliberate. One night, long after the streetlights flickered on and the neighborhood retreated indoors, Daniel stood by his window and watched a dark sedan drive slowly past his home, the same route, the same hour, for 3 nights straight. He couldn't make out the driver, only the faint glow of a cigarette in the dark. Whoever it was wanted to be seen. He started keeping records again, camera feeds, license plates, patterns. Every detail went into a folder, methodical and cold. He'd buried that side of himself when he retired, but now it stirred, the investigator, the tactician, the hunter. 2 weeks later, the pressure escalated. The temporary HOA committee's files were stolen from the community office. The locks were intact, no signs of forced entry, but all the digital copies, all the backup drives, gone. Then an email hit every resident's inbox. It was an unsigned statement claiming the new committee was illegitimate, accusing Daniel by name of hacking into HOA records and leaking private information. It painted him not as a savior, but as a criminal. Within hours the rumors spread. Some neighbors stood by him, others pulled away. Trust fractured again, not from corruption this time but from fear, exactly what the attackers wanted. Lee's voice trembled that night when she asked him if they should move. Daniel didn't answer right away. He stared out at the cul-de-sac, peaceful, silent, false, and felt something deep inside harden. He had fought men with armies, governments with reach beyond borders. He would not be broken by suburban bullies with keyboards and grudges. No, he would end this permanently. The next day he went to the courthouse and filed for access to the HOA's investigation records. As a victim and a resident, he was entitled to them. When the clerk handed him the file, his suspicions solidified into certainty. Karen hadn't acted alone. Several board members, including 2 contractors and a notary, had cut plea deals to avoid indictment. But there, in one report's appendix, was a name that made Daniel's pulse slow. Ethan Cole, a private security consultant and Karen's neighborhood enforcement advisor. His company had been responsible for managing HOA surveillance and data security. Daniel recognized the name. Years ago, Cole had been investigated by the Bureau for cybercrime, extortion, data tampering, coercion, before slipping through the cracks under a plea deal. Now he was back, hiding behind the quiet respectability of suburban contracts. It all fit. The stolen files, the false accusations, the intimidation campaign. Cole was orchestrating it all not to save Karen but to protect his interests. If the full scope of the fraud came to light, his company would collapse. He was fighting for survival. That night, Daniel drove to the community office under the cover of rain. He'd already bypassed more sophisticated security systems in his career. The HOA's locks were nothing. Inside, the office smelled of paper and disinfectant, the air heavy with dust and secrets. He moved with purpose. In less than 10 minutes he had accessed the central server, a small black box hidden behind the filing cabinet. He copied the drive, knowing it contained the real logs, the access codes, security footage, and digital trails of every file theft and unauthorized entry. When he opened the folder back home, the evidence unfolded like a confession. Video clips timestamped showing Cole's hired men entering the office at night, emails traced to dummy addresses tied to his firm, payment records that linked every act of vandalism and intimidation to one account. It was all there, enough to burn Cole's operation to the ground. Daniel prepared a new dossier, cleaner, sharper, airtight. This wasn't for the local authorities anymore. He sent it directly to a federal contact, someone who still owed him a favor. Within hours, confirmation arrived. An investigation would reopen under federal jurisdiction. Cole wouldn't be able to hide behind local politics this time, but Daniel didn't stop there. He knew Cole, men like him didn't wait quietly to be caught. They fought back hard. The following night the dark sedan returned. This time it didn't pass by, it stopped. Two figures stepped out. They approached the porch slowly, confidently, until the motion light burst to life and flooded the yard. Daniel was already waiting. He didn't confront them, not yet. He let the camera above the door record everything, their faces, their plates, their every move. When they realized they were being filmed, they turned and disappeared into the night. The next morning, Daniel forwarded the footage to his contact. Within hours, federal warrants were issued. The storm had come full circle. By the week's end, arrests were made. Ethan Cole was taken in under charges of obstruction, cybercrime, and intimidation. His firm's offices were raided. News outlets once again descended on Cedar Ridge, this time not to report corruption but its collapse. For the first time in months, Daniel allowed himself to exhale. The retaliation had failed. The counterstrike had been neutralized. And yet, as he stood on his porch that night, listening to the steady rhythm of crickets and distant traffic, he couldn't shake a single haunting thought, the one truth every agent learns to live with: evil doesn't vanish, it adapts. Cedar Ridge was safe for now. But Daniel had seen enough cycles of power to know that somewhere, someone else was already learning from this, planning the next move, perfecting the next scheme. He glanced at the horizon where the last light of day bled into darkness and thought of the badge locked in his safe. He wasn't just a homeowner, he never had been. He was still an agent of justice, of balance, of consequence. And the world would always need men like him. The dawn that broke over Cedar Ridge that morning was quiet, too quiet. The sky glowed pale gold over the mist-laced lawns, but the neighborhood that had once hummed with weekend mowers and children's laughter now carried a strange stillness. The war that had consumed it for months was over, at least on paper. The HOA was dismantled, its corruption exposed, its enforcers arrested. And yet Daniel Harlow knew better. Wars like these didn't end with paperwork, they ended with reckoning. He stood by his porch, coffee in hand, watching as federal vehicles rolled slowly past the cul-de-sac, black SUVs with tinted windows, their engines low and steady. Inside them were agents from his old world, men and women who had come to finish what he started. But this time he wasn't one of them. He was a civilian, or so it appeared. He had played his part. He had lit the match. Now the system would carry out the burn. Still, there was unfinished business. Ethan Cole's arrest had broken open more than expected. When federal agents raided his firm's servers, they found evidence that went far beyond Cedar Ridge: fraudulent property seizures, rigged HOA elections, and private data sold to developers across several states. The network was vast, spanning communities that had quietly fallen under the same kind of tyranny Daniel had faced. Cedar Ridge had only been one battlefield in a much larger war. And at its center, buried beneath layers of shell companies and offshore accounts, was one name: Karen Whitmore. The HOA president had never truly left the game. Even from behind bars, she had been the phantom pulling strings, her influence bleeding through old loyalties and silent bribes. Her release date had been moved up pending new evidence in her favor, conveniently timed and mysteriously approved by a sympathetic judge. That was the final straw. Daniel had seen bureaucratic corruption before, but this was personal. Karen had not only destroyed his home, she had violated the sanctity of law itself, twisting it until justice bent beneath her will. He knew that if she walked free, her empire would rise again, uglier and stronger. So he decided to end it, completely, permanently, without compromise. He called in one last favor, not from the bureau, from someone older, someone whose loyalty wasn't written in policy but in shared scars. An old field partner named Marcus Hale, a data analyst turned whistleblower who had once owed his freedom to Daniel's silence. When Marcus answered, his voice was low, measured, expectant. He didn't ask for explanations. He already knew what kind of war Daniel was waging. Within days, Marcus delivered what Daniel needed: a digital trail tracing Karen's appeal funding to offshore accounts tied to Cole's company. Every transfer, every signature, every timestamp. Enough to expose the entire judicial manipulation scheme for what it was: a last, desperate attempt to rewrite justice. But Daniel didn't send it to the bureau this time. He didn't trust that path anymore, not when money could twist truth and erase guilt. Instead, he sent it to the one place corruption couldn't silence: the public. At precisely 8:00 a.m., while Cedar Ridge residents sipped coffee and scrolled their phones, a flood of documents appeared online. Emails, bank transfers, court communications. Every secret that Karen Whitmore and her allies had hidden now lived in the digital daylight, impossible to contain, impossible to deny. The story spread like fire through the quiet suburbs of America. HOA corruption network exposed. Federal agent ties break multi-state property scam. Homeowners demand accountability. Karen's appeal crumbled overnight. The judge who had backed her was suspended pending investigation. Cole's firm was seized under federal order. The HOA corruption scandal became a national symbol, not of property management but of unchecked greed and the quiet wars fought behind picket fences. And through it all, Daniel remained silent. He gave no interviews, no statements, no credit. His name appeared in whispers and rumors, but he neither confirmed nor denied them. He didn't need to. Justice wasn't about recognition, it was about balance restored. Weeks later, Cedar Ridge began to rebuild. The neighborhood elected a new community board, one run by residents, not enforcers. The fences were repainted, the gardens regrew, and the air slowly filled again with normal life. But the scars remained, subtle, invisible, buried beneath the surface. The neighbors had seen what power unchecked could become. They had watched their world unravel under rules meant to protect them, and they would never forget it. One evening, as the sun melted into amber light, Daniel stood outside the frame of his newly rebuilt home. The porch smelled of fresh pine and rain. Lee was inside unpacking boxes, laughter faint through the open window. It was a sound he'd almost forgot. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of months lift, piece by piece. Justice had been served, but justice always came at a cost. Then a faint rustle behind him, he turned. A familiar figure stood at the edge of the driveway, a man in a dark suit holding an envelope. The agent's face was calm, unreadable. "You've done good work here," he said quietly, placing the envelope in Daniel's hand. "But there's something you should see." Inside were printed pages, files on other neighborhoods, other HOAs. Different names, different faces, same pattern. The corruption hadn't stopped, it had spread. Cedar Ridge had been only one head of a hydra. Daniel closed the envelope slowly, the wind brushing against his face like an unspoken warning. He looked past the agent toward the setting sun, golden, burning, endless. He thought he'd buried the badge for good, but justice was never a thing one retired from. It called you back again and again until the work was finished. And for Daniel Harlow, the work was far from over. He walked back to his porch, eyes steady, pulse calm, mind already aligning the next steps, not out of rage anymore, but out of duty. A quiet, resolute duty to the ordinary people who never saw the wars fought in their names. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the horizon, not storm, but omen. The reckoning wasn't the end, it was only the beginning, because when power devours peace, there must always be someone left to restore it. And Daniel Harlow, a federal agent, homeowner, survivor, had once again become what the world needed him to be, a silent guardian of justice, a reckoning that never sleeps.